Chapter 10, Small Group Communication. In this chapter, we're going to look at the definitions of what a small group is, really, versus a team, what a virtual team or group is, and we'll talk a little bit about the role of culture and power in groups. And then we're going to spend a little bit of time on brainstorming and its 4 rules. And then a little bit about problem solving in groups. So a group, as we're speaking of a small group here, is a collection of individuals who are connected to one another by some common purpose. They are interdependent with each other. They have some degree of organization among them as a group, and they see themselves as a group. We'll talk about each one of these elements briefly. A common purpose. So a small group, as we're referring to small groups, have a common purpose. Each of the individuals recognizes their similarity in their reasons for interacting together. There's interdependence, as there is in every interpersonal relationship between people, which means that the actions of one member impacts the other members. And ideally, each individual recognizes that fact. There's some degree of organization or some structure to the group. They see themselves as a group. Each of the individuals recognizes that they're part of this group. And this, of course, makes for better cohesiveness among the members when each member recognizes that they are part of this group. Now, a team is a specific type of small group. A team has a specific purpose. They generally, as individuals, have clearly defined roles. They have a specific goal, and that is their ultimate purpose. And they recognize that they are all working on this goal. Virtual groups, virtual teams. An example of a virtual group would be going to Facebook. A virtual team, an example would be people who work in an organization. They're working together on a common issue, and they're in different locations, so they interact virtually. Now, there's advantages and disadvantages to working in groups. Advantages certainly are the fact that you gain a lot of different perspectives and different types of knowledge. Every individual has a strength or strengths that they bring to the group. There are disadvantages, of course. It might be more time consuming to get everyone's feedback and input. There may be a bit of perspective overload for some folks. Might be too much information sometimes to take into consideration. And there's also the danger of groupthink. We'll talk about groupthink in chapter 11, but that can be a disadvantage and something to watch out for anytime you're part of a group or a team. What about culture in the small group? Well, everyone brings their own culture or cultures to any interaction that they have with other people. So there might be specific group norms that are expected between individuals, even though they bring different cultural elements as individuals. When they come to this particular group, there might be some expectation that they have certain standards for the group. There may or may not be high context conditions. There may be the context might be certain expectations of what the person knows already before they come into the group. And this may be to a greater extent or a lesser extent. Norms are rules or standards of behavior appropriate for the small group. So group norms, they may be explicit or implicit. Explicit rules are spelled out. An example might be, for instance, you're part of a team at work and you discuss the fact in the first meeting that you are going to meet every morning at 8 a.m., or rather every Monday morning at 8 a.m., something like that. That is explicitly spelled out. Implicit role expectations are unspoken expectations that it's assumed everyone understands. So there are role expectations that each member might have in a group. Of course, every group is so individual and so different, depending on what their aim is and what their purpose of getting together is. But there may be certain expectations of each person within the group. Cohesiveness, of course, is more likely to keep the members on task and realizing that what they do is going to affect others. Cohesiveness is like a stick-to-itiveness. Stick-to-itiveness. Group cohesiveness. You want to be working in partnership with people for this common cause or this common goal. Now, power is what allows one person to control the behavior of others to some extent. And power sometimes gets a bad rap in our culture. It can sometimes have connotations, different connotations to different people. But power isn't just hierarchical. Let's look at types of power. There are 6 types of power according to our text. Let's look at each one of these. And I'm going to emphasize the first 2 probably because they're pretty fascinating. Now, one type of power is legitimate power. This is when you have the title. The person has the title. They are the supervisor. They are the president. They are the parent. They are the, it's just a title that gives them their power. Now, the second type of power is referent power, and this is quite different. Referent power is when someone is respected, they are admired, they are looked to for guidance, perhaps. Here's a question for you to think about. Does a person with legitimate power always have referent power? Does a person with referent power always have legitimate power, always have the title? Going on to reward power and coercive power. Reward power is when a person has power to give rewards to someone. Coercive power is when they have power to punish. Expert, information, persuasive power. These have to do with knowledge, having knowledge. People may come to you because you have information, you have expertise, you have persuasive power. So you can see that there are many types of power. They don't have to necessarily be just legitimate types of power. And oftentimes people with, of course, legitimate power might also have reward and coercive power and expert power, or they may not, depending on the situation. Now, when teams or groups are trying to generate ideas, because often you'll be part of a team that is trying to solve a problem. And there will need to be some generation of ideas. Now, brainstorming is one technique to maximize the opportunity to generate ideas. And some of the rules of a true brainstorming session are the fact that there should be no criticism or evaluation while the ideas are being expressed by people in the room. Let's take, for instance, you've got 6 or 7 people in a room, or any number really, and you start a brainstorming session. You want people to just spout out as many ideas. We're looking at quantity of ideas over quality here. And ideally, someone will be tasked with jotting them all on the board, writing them all down, recording all of these ideas. People may build on ideas of someone who went before them. The idea is to come up with as many different ideas as possible. And the wilder, the better. Combine them, build on them. We're looking for quantity in this brainstorming session. There is to be no criticism or evaluation during the brainstorming session. Now, this is harder than you might think. I've very seldom seen a true brainstorming session in my experience and in my career, because people are so apt to want to say things like, oh, we've done that before. Oh, that's crazy. But in a true brainstorming session, you do not do that. You hold off, because once the brainstorming session is over, and hopefully you've generated tons of different ideas and you've built on each other and recorded all these, then you can go back and evaluate each of them after the brainstorming session. And this really allows sometimes the wildest ideas, maybe may not be the answer, but they spark an idea that will work. So we're looking at quantity over quality during the brainstorming session. How are problem-solving groups used at work? Think of your own experience in school or at a job you've had. How are problem-solving groups used? Well, generally, just as the title says, they solve a problem or reach a decision. Here is the classic problem-solving approach. 5 steps. And I'll give you an example of using these 5 steps. First step is defining and analyzing. Second one is establishing criteria. Then you identify possible solutions. You might select the best idea to try out, and you test that selected solution. So I'll give you an example of using these 5. Let's say you're on a work team, on a job, and your boss has given your team, say there may be any number of people on your team. Let's say there's 4 people on the team. So your first job would be to define and analyze. Define what the problem is. Say your boss says, well, they probably will define it for you. They say, we have to get 30,000 widgets made between these dates, and we need to know how to do this. Okay, that is the problem. 30,000 widgets to be produced during the month of March. So that's definition. Let's establish the criteria. Well, we have one criteria. We have to do it within the month of March. How about, can we hire any more people? Can we use any overtime? Well, let's say the answer is no, we can't hire more people, but we can give the staff we have up to 10 hours of overtime a week. So that's the criteria. We establish criteria. What parameters do we have to work within? Identify possible solutions. Now, one way to do this might be what? Brainstorming, right. So we'll come up with different solutions, perhaps using brainstorming. Maybe come up with 2 or 3 or however many we come up with, but we'll have to narrow it down somewhat, because we ultimately have to select the best solution, agree on what we want to try out, and test that selected solution. Now, when making that decision on which is the best solution, sometimes that might be determined by authority. That may be determined by the boss who gave you this project They may say, bring me your solutions, and I will decide which one to use. Or you might, sometimes majority rule, you might take a vote within your team, or you may decide to come to a consensus. If it's left to you to come up with one solution, you might have to work on coming to a consensus. And this is basically agreeing on what would be the best way to handle this situation. This can take some time, of course.